From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Shung, and this matters. Grocery store workers are essential workers. Shouldn't they be paid like it? At the start of the pandemic, the big three Canadian grocers, Loblaw, Metro, and Empire, which own Sobeys, introduced Hero Pay for their employees, a pay bump of about $2 extra an hour. Some tangible things came out of that. The extra pay put money into employees' pockets during an uncertain time, and essential frontline workers were finally getting some recognition for doing unsung but valuable work. It didn't last long. Last June, a few months into the pandemic, the major grocers canceled Hero Pay. But a major company has not only kept up its pay bump, but made it permanent. Costco, the US-based mega wholesaler, has a reputation for paying above minimum wage, providing benefits, and paid sick leave, in an industry that usually has none of that. On This Matters, we're joined by Rosa Saba, business reporter for the Toronto Star. Rosa has reported on the practices of Hero Pay. We'll talk about why corporate responsibility is becoming more than a buzzword, as the concept of winners and losers in business is being challenged. Rosa, thanks for your time. Good to talk to you again.
You too.
Many people will be familiar with Hero Pay during the pandemic, but can you give us a refresher? What was the motivation behind it, and what kinds of businesses in Canada are continuing to do that?
Yeah, so in terms of the companies that I looked at in my recent story, we were looking at what we like to call the big three. So Loblaw's, Metro, and Empire Group, which owns Sobeys. It's fairly well known that at the beginning of the pandemic, all big three offered pandemic pay of around $2 an hour, although there were some differences for all their frontline workers. They're not the only companies that did that, but they did get a lot of attention because around 3.5 months later, they actually canceled that pandemic pay. Experts are a little divided on why they did it. Some like to think that it's about appreciation. Others are a little more cynical and say, well, at the time we had just had CERB, and CERB might have seemed more attractive to some of these people. Others might have said it's kind of like a recognition of the danger, and again, an incentive to keep people working during a time when lower paid work wasn't maybe super attractive. We didn't know a lot about the pandemic. So that's kind of what I focused on. I wanted to note as well that all three grocers or their executives did end up in front of the House of Commons Industry Committee talking about the fact they canceled that Hero Pay. So it did get a lot of attention.
The temporary pay premium was never about safety, Loblaw said in a statement today. It was a recognition of extraordinary effort. Our stores are now operating at a normal pace, albeit in a new way.
Unlike Loblaw's and Metro, I do want to note that Sobeys reinstated its pandemic pay for grocery store and distribution center workers in Toronto and Peel. That was last fall. And then they recently extended it across Ontario and into Quebec as the pandemic, as we know, has gotten worse. And of course, Metro has also given out gift cards to its employees 3 times during the pandemic. This has put some pressure on Loblaws and Metro to do the same as Sobeys. Obviously, the pandemic has not ended, is definitely worse than it was last year. But the companies do say that, while their sales rose during the pandemic, costs related to COVID-19 were eating into their bottom line.
And it is worth noting that when they were in front of the House of Commons, there was some PR blowback when they announced that they were withdrawing that Hero Pay. That was in the headlines for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's something that people still mention. Like I said, as Sobeys has reinstated its pandemic pay, that has put a lot of pressure on Loblaws and Metro and other grocers for obvious reasons. But, so far they haven't followed suit. And as my story notes, in comparison, Costco gave its frontline hourly workers Hero Pay of $2 an hour for about a year, from March to March, and then replaced the program with a permanent $1 an hour raise. So a bit of a different approach there.
Right. So Costco in this time, again, they are not part of the big three, but there are hundreds of locations across Canada with thousands of employees. They have set themselves apart in this moment of how they pay workers, how much they're paying them, what kinds of benefits there are. There is a difference between them and the other grocers.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's just over 100 Costco locations in Canada. They even added to that number this year. I believe it was 101 in August, and it's now 103, something like that. They set themselves apart not just during the pandemic, but before the pandemic. They're known for paying more than minimum wage. They significantly increased the wages for hourly workers year over year. They offer benefits, sick pay, other perks. And they say that because of this, employees stay longer than they might otherwise, which in turn benefits the business. So the pandemic pay decision was definitely an extension of the policies of the culture that they already had in place. It's definitely important to point out that Costco is not necessarily your regular grocery store. People shop there for groceries. It's definitely comparable, but it is a bit of a different model, both in terms of the way it sells, what it sells, and of course, how it pays its employees.
And you asked Costco about this permanent raise, about why they extended their pay. What's their reasoning?
They're pretty frank about it being a business decision. They did say they felt it was the right thing to do. But, when you ask Costco about why they pay their employees the way they do, why they offer benefits, they are, again, pretty frank about the fact that it's a business decision. They say employees staying longer is good for the business. Internal promotion is good for the business. Experts say that's true. Employee retention can save money, can benefit the business in the long run. Costco is pretty honest about that. They feel that it's an investment. They use the word investment. And that's how they view both the hero pay and that permanent raise.
We have covered this idea of corporate responsibility on This Matters before. I know you've reported on it. And again, this seems like this idea being put into action, which is that the idea behind it, at least, is that businesses have, this social responsibility to do the right thing, and their employees in turn, will stay longer. That's good for business. And it's shown that companies are often financially rewarded for this. Is that the case for Costco too? They're making out pretty well in the pandemic, right?
Yeah, not just during the pandemic, but over the decades. It's a very, profitable business. Just at their stock price, it's more than quadrupled over the years. It does quite well. Yeah, so, I spoke to a couple of analysts about this, and they said there's a short game and a long game, and Costco's playing the long game, which is, paying more upfront in the hopes that employees will stay longer. Hiring people costs money, training people costs money, but it also costs money to have people who don't see the job as a long-term option. At Costco, many of the employees, according to Costco, of course, see it as a longer-term option, see it as a career. They know that if they stay there, they're going to get a raise, they're going to have these perks, they're going to have a chance at internal promotion. When there is an internal promotion, there's more respect for that manager because the manager has been that frontline employee. And all those things are the benefits are longer term, but they're there. And I think that, it's safe to say that for Costco, that long game has absolutely won out over the short-term option of trying to save money on things like wages.
And especially in an industry, a sector that isn't necessarily known for higher wages or benefits, this is something that potentially could pip them over other employers, especially if people are looking in that line of work.
Yeah, and especially as Costco gains market share. One of the analysts I spoke to mentioned that Costco, along with Walmart, they've both been sort of gaining market share in the grocery sector. Not over the big three yet, but they're definitely gaining. I think the fact that 2 more Costco's opened in the past 6-ish months kind of speaks to that as well. And so it is definitely possible, according to him and others, that, as that continues, that could actually put more pressure on grocers along with the pandemic. I think it's a pressure that has been accelerated by the pandemic. There's definitely this macro trend that is going on as well of, especially the younger generation sort of caring a little bit more about how corporations treat their employees, how they pay their employees. Another trend that has definitely been accelerated by the pandemic. So it's going to be interesting, I think, to see where the sector goes in terms of employment.
We'll be right back. I wonder if that is the wider lens that we might look at this situation with. Whether we're talking about hero pay or a higher minimum wage or paid sick leave, which of course is a big topic in Ontario specifically right now, the fact that Costco, a multi-billion-dollar company, is providing these benefits and that is news. You spoke to economists about this. What do they think about what this moment says, maybe about the state of work, especially for essential and lower wage workers?
Yeah. So, I think the outrage over the hero pay as well as the current push for paid sick leave shows that the public is, we know this, of course, the public is so much more aware now of the work of essential workers, many of whom are low income, often racialized workers who don't have the same protections that you and I do, right? Working from home, paid sick leave, all this kind of stuff. The work of someone in a grocery store has so much more value in many people's eyes than it did before the pandemic, in part because it has become more dangerous. And I do think it's important to note, this is something that Jim Stanford pointed out. Part of the reason Costco looks good here is because it's just not doing the legal bare minimum, right? So Jim and others would argue that the current wage minimums and the lack of other province and state protections like paid sick leave, the minimum is not enough for a work to live on. If the minimum was better, if the protections were better, maybe Costco wouldn't stand out so much. But I think that, the pandemic has certainly shown us how important the work of those low-income workers is in so many sectors. And so any company that does things even a little differently is bound to stand out.
Right. And as you mentioned before, too, consumers are more tapped in now than perhaps they were pre-pandemic of thinking about work, about who has a more equitable workspace, a safer workspace. And obviously, people can vote with their dollars.
Absolutely. Now, this might be a little early in the game, but some of the experts I interviewed thought that the fact that Sobeys has reinstated pandemic pay was perhaps a sign of changes to come. I wanted to note as well that the CEO of Sobeys in recent months came out in favor of a grocery code of conduct, which is a bit more of an industry insider thing, but still shows that at least one of the big three is interested in change. I think that between that and maybe, again, pressure when it comes to market share, if people do start voting with their dollar and increasingly going to companies that are known for paying more, especially during the pandemic, that could definitely change the game. Whether the pandemic actually results in meaningful long-term and, importantly, widespread change, that remains to be seen. It could be that these changes would happen from individual companies, doing air quotes, the right thing, or it could be that it comes on a government level. You know what I mean? When it comes to minimum wage and sick leave and that kind of thing, it could be a combination of those things. We definitely have yet to see it, but there's no question that there's pressure for those things to happen.
There's definitely more public pressure, I would say, than, maybe 2018 when we're talking about the conditions for essential frontline workers. This wasn't as much part of the conversation. And now things like hero pay, things like a higher minimum wage, that is a much more mainstream conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's kind of sad to say this, but, seeing all the workplace outbreaks, seeing all the racialized workers and low-income workers in specific areas like Peel.
Big news coming out of Peel region this morning, a major announcement saying all businesses in the region with 5 or more recent COVID cases that occurred in the workplace, those workplaces will be ordered to shut down.
Seeing them all getting COVID, seeing some of them dying, seeing their family members dying. It's been a huge wake-up call for a lot of people. I think that's a really sad reality. And at the very least, I know many people hope that some permanent changes are going to come out of this because there's so much work. The grocery store is one thing. We go to the grocery store and we get our groceries and we see these people, but there's also all these workers that we don't see, the ones processing the food, the ones in manufacturing, the ones in these really, really close conditions, perhaps going to work sick before and during the pandemic because they couldn't afford to miss a day's work. I think that has all become so much more public now.
I wonder this conversation, there's a line in your reporting that you said, in business, as in life, there are winners and there are losers. But that also, it doesn't have to be that way, that there is a possibility here where both sides can actually win. And that, especially if there is long-term committed change here, that this could be good for both sides. Do you think Costco and maybe other businesses like it, could there be almost a realigning of what frontline work looks like and how people are paid for it?
Sure. Well, again, the fact that Costco has always paid more and has always offered these things, and has continued to be a successful business, obviously proves what those retail analysts were telling me, is that, that there is a long game that you can play and that, the workers can be compensated well and feel safe in their jobs while the business continues to be profitable. I think that, so often in the capitalist landscape, this is kind of like some big picture thinking, but so often the workers are kind of pitted against the good of the business. I'm not talking about any business in particular here, just more generally, but I think that Costco, and I'm sure other companies out there as well, are proof that a business can continue to be profitable while also giving frontline workers an actual career, right? I think that, I'm sure there are many good examples of it. And during the pandemic, especially, I think it's an example of frontline workers and how it could be more widespread. I think it's a really interesting conversation. Again, I would like to go back to what Jim said about the fact that, we're always comparing companies to the minimum, right? And this conversation could change so much if the minimum changes. But even with the federal budget raising the federal minimum to $15, that's still $1 less than Costco's new starting wage, right? So it's just kind of interesting to make that comparison.
Right, of where the bar is and what businesses are doing.
Yeah, many would say that the bar is pretty low.
Rosa, thank you as always for your reporting, and thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And that is Rosa Saba, business reporter for the Toronto Star. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.